23 million Americans have spit into a plastic tube hoping to learn who they really are. Most expected confirmation. Thousands didn't. A woman in South Carolina, certain her ancestry was entirely European, opened her results to find African ancestry she couldn't explain. A man in Utah found Native American DNA that no one in his family had ever mentioned. Neither had a story, a rumor, or a photograph to account for it. So scientists asked a question no census had ever answered accurately. How many Americans are carrying ancestry their families erased? Not misremembered. Erased. The answer required comparing hundreds of thousands of genomes against reference populations from every inhabited continent. A scale of comparison that simply didn't exist a generation earlier. What researchers found didn't just fill in a few family trees. It exposed a hidden genetic history of the United States, one that written records had in many cases deliberately buried, and one that no single family working alone with old letters and fading memories could ever have uncovered on its own. For most of the country's existence, ancestry in America wasn't a private matter, it was law. Slave schedules, immigration ledgers, and census forms sorted people into categories like white, Negro, mulatto, or Indian, often based on nothing more than a clerk's visual judgment as he walked down a street or through a plantation, deciding in seconds how a person would be classified for the rest of their life and how their children would be classified after them. There was no genetic test behind these labels. There was only a man with a pen, a quota to meet, and a set of assumptions about what ancestry was supposed to look like. Those labels decided who could vote, who could marry whom, who could own land, and whether a newborn child would enter the world free or enslaved. They determined which schools a child could attend, which neighborhoods a family could live in, and which courtrooms would ever take their testimony seriously. An entire legal and social architecture was built on the premise that ancestry was visible, stable, and impossible to hide. But categories written on paper don't always match what actually happens inside a household, a plantation, or a frontier settlement. Relationships crossed the lines the law tried to enforce, sometimes by choice, far more often by force. Children were born who fit no official box the clerks had invented. Families rewrote their own histories, sometimes out of shame, sometimes out of fear, sometimes simply because remembering the truth out loud was dangerous, and silence was the only inheritance that felt safe to pass down. By the time genetics caught up with history, one question mattered more than any other. Could DNA reveal what documents had hidden or distorted? Could a genome expose migrations and unions that no official ever bothered to record accurately or chose not to, because recording them honestly would have undermined the entire system those officials were paid to enforce? Here's how scientists went looking for the answer, stripped to its essence. Your genome isn't a uniform blend of your ancestors, evenly mixed like paint. It's a mosaic of segments, and each segment can be traced back to a specific ancestral population, whether West African, Northern European, or Indigenous American. By comparing thousands of these segments against reference genomes collected from populations around the world, researchers can estimate, with real statistical confidence, how much of a person's ancestry traces to each region, and roughly how many generations ago that ancestry entered the family line. In 2014, geneticists Katarzyna Bryce and David Reich applied this method to autosomal DNA for more than 160,000 Americans who had used the testing company 23andMe and agreed to take part in research. It remains one of the largest genetic surveys of ancestry ever conducted inside a single nation, drawing on a dataset no historian, genealogist, or census bureau had ever had access to before. Reich's lab at Harvard had already built a reputation studying ancient DNA from skeletons thousands of years old. Turning that same toolkit on living Americans was, in its own way, just as radical. They weren't measuring individuals one at a time. They were mapping a hidden genetic history, state by state, county by county in some analyses, one that no census had ever managed to capture honestly, and one that most families had never fully known about themselves. When the team turned to white, self-identified European Americans, they expected a clean result. European ancestry, a trace of Native American ancestry in a few regions, and African ancestry close to zero. That's what America's racial categories had insisted on for centuries. Two populations sealed off from each other, two branches that supposedly never touched, never intertwined, never shared a single ancestor in the recent past. The data said otherwise. Roughly 1 in every 100 self-identified European Americans carried at least 1% African ancestry, enough to indicate a documented African ancestor within the last 6 to 11 generations. That's not a distant prehistoric connection. It's an ancestor who may have lived within reach of written memory, someone whose name might once have appeared on a record somewhere, before that record was lost, destroyed, or simply never made. Spread across the national population, that number translates into millions of white Americans carrying African ancestry their families never mentioned, never explained, and in most cases, never even suspected existed. And this ancestry wasn't scattered randomly across the map. It was concentrated overwhelmingly in the South, South Carolina, Louisiana, the two states where plantation slavery had operated at its most intense scale for the longest stretch of time, with the largest enslaved populations relative to the free population anywhere in the country. In parts of the antebellum South, enslaved people outnumbered free residents entirely, a demographic reality that made the kind of contact researchers were now detecting almost mathematically inevitable. Researchers had a name for the pattern staring back at them from the data. They called it a genetic echo of the one-drop rule, the legal doctrine that classified any person with any known African ancestry as black, no matter their appearance, no matter how many generations removed. This wasn't just an informal custom passed down through prejudice, it was written directly into law. Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924 classified anyone with any trace of non-white ancestry as legally non-white, closing off the last loopholes that had allowed some mixed ancestry families to be legally recognized as white. Decades earlier, in 1896, the Supreme Court had heard the case of Homer Plessy, a man who was 7/8 European and 1/8 African, and ruled that he could still be legally barred from a whites-only railway car. Plessy became the foundation for separate but equal, a doctrine that stood for nearly 60 years. The one-drop rule, in other words, wasn't simply a belief people carried in their heads. It was legislated, litigated, and enforced by the highest court in the country. The genetic echo researchers found decades later was the direct biological trace of a legal system built specifically to erase exactly this kind of evidence. For decades after slavery ended, some families with mixed ancestry who could physically pass as white chose to do exactly that. It wasn't vanity, it was survival, calculated and deliberate, weighed against very real consequences. This wasn't a rare or hidden phenomenon confined to family rumor. It has a documented history of its own. The writer and literary critic Anatole Brouillard spent decades as one of the most respected book critics at the New York Times, known to colleagues and readers as a white man of French descent. Only after his death did a widely read profile reveal what he had spent his adult life concealing. He was born in New Orleans to a Creole family with African ancestry, and he made a deliberate choice early in his career to leave that identity behind entirely. He changed how he spoke of his past. He distanced himself from family members who couldn't pass. He built an entire public identity on a mission, not because he was ashamed of talent or ambition, but because mid-century America made the cost of being visibly black professionally and socially devastating. Broyard wasn't the only documented case, and not every family that passed did so alone or in secret shame. Decades before him, Michael Healy, an Irish immigrant and Georgia planter, had 10 children with an enslaved woman named Eliza Clark. Several of those children crossed into white society and rose to extraordinary prominence. One became a Catholic bishop, another became president of Georgetown University. A third became a captain in the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service, commanding ships in the Arctic. Within the family, their origins were known. To the institutions that celebrated them, they were not. The Healys show that passing wasn't always a lone act of desperate concealment. Sometimes it was a coordinated family strategy, spanning siblings and generations, built to open doors that would have stayed permanently closed otherwise. Broyard's story became famous because a writer eventually uncovered it and made it public, digging through records and interviews most people never have reason to attempt. For every documented case like his, researchers now believe there were thousands that never became a magazine profile or a biography. They became instead a single line in a family's story that quietly went untold. A grandmother who didn't like to talk about her childhood in Louisiana. A great-grandfather whose birthplace kept shifting depending on who was asking and when. A name spelled one way on one document and another way on the next, filed by a clerk who never asked why and never needed to. Here's what that choice actually looked like, multiplied across an entire region over and over in ways no single record could capture. Somewhere in 18th or 19th century South Carolina, a child was born to a white father and a mother who was enslaved. If that child survived and was light-skinned enough, they might eventually cross into white society and never look back, never speak of where they came from again. During Jim Crow, passing wasn't only about identity. It meant escaping racial violence that could arrive without warning on any street, at any hour, for any reason or none at all. It meant access to better schools, safer neighborhoods, and jobs otherwise closed off entirely by law. It also meant a permanent kind of erasure. A name was changed. A family relocated to a town where no one knew their history. A story was buried so deep that the next generation grew up believing the family's past began exactly where the silence did, with no reason to dig any further. But the DNA can only tell us that the crossing happened. It cannot show what it cost. Broyard, by his own daughter's later account, could not attend his own mother's funeral in the way he wanted to, without risking the questions that a visibly black family gathering might raise among his New York colleagues. That is not simply concealment. It is severance, a deliberate cutting of ties to the people who loved you most, in order to survive among people who would have rejected you for who you actually were. The silence that protected one generation often became an ache the next generation couldn't name, an absence they felt without ever being told what had been lost. That decision, repeated across thousands of families over multiple generations, left almost no paper trail. No deed, no letter, no line in a family Bible. But it left something else behind, something far harder to erase than any document, a pattern distributed silently across the genomes of millions of descendants, waiting for a technology that didn't exist yet, and a scientist who knew exactly where to look for it. Which brings the story to the other side of that same history. If white Americans were quietly carrying African ancestry no one had documented, what would researchers find when they turned the analysis around and looked at the population most directly shaped by slavery itself? What they found wasn't just unexpected. It was the number the entire study had been building toward. Self-identified African Americans carried, on average, genomes that were roughly 73% African in origin. Almost no one found that surprising. What came next did. That African ancestry itself wasn't a single, undifferentiated block either. Genetic analysis shows it traces disproportionately to specific regions of West and West Central Africa, including Senegambia, the Bight of Benin, and the Congo Basin, echoing the documented ports and routes the transatlantic slave trade relied on for nearly 400 years. In some cases, researchers can identify which African regions contributed most heavily to the ancestry of African Americans in specific southern states, a level of precision that turns a single percentage into something closer to a map, tracing named coastlines and river mouths to named counties an ocean away. The remaining ancestry wasn't a rounding error. On average, self-identified African Americans carried close to 24% European ancestry. Nearly a quarter of the genetic material in the average African American genome traced directly back to Europe, a proportion far higher than most people inside or outside the field had assumed going in. Sit with what that quarter actually represents. Not migration, not marriage records, not two families choosing to unite under any recognized law. It represents a system in which enslaved women had no legal right to refuse. It represents slaveholders, men who wrote laws claiming to protect racial purity, fathering children with the very women they legally claimed to own as property, then raising those children within a system explicitly designed to deny the relationship ever occurred. That quarter of a genome is a genetic record of sustained systemic violence, one that no plantation ledger, no census, and no official history ever chose to document. The DNA remembered what the paperwork was designed to hide. These estimates carry margins of error, and the sample wasn't a perfectly random slice of the country, drawn as it was from people who chose to purchase a commercial DNA test. But the broad pattern has since been confirmed and sharpened by later studies using larger data sets and improved reference populations conducted by independent teams working from different starting assumptions. The exact number moves slightly from paper to paper. The story underneath it does not. In the years since the study was published, its influence has only grown. Larger data sets from Ancestry DNA, from academic research consortia, and from expanded 23andMe cohorts have repeatedly tested the same questions with more people and sharper tools. The findings have held. What began as one striking paper has become a foundational reference point for how population geneticists think about ancestry across the Americas, and it has fed directly into a much larger public conversation about what genetic ancestry can and cannot say about race, identity, and belonging. This wasn't evenly spread across the country either. It carried the fingerprint of specific regions and specific decades. States with the deepest, longest ties to plantation slavery, Louisiana and South Carolina, prominent among them, showed distinct genetic signatures tracing back to the late 1700s and early 1800s, the exact decades when the plantation economy was at its most entrenched and most profitable. The genome was functioning as an unintentional historical record, keeping the exact kind of account that plantation owners had every reason to keep off the books and every incentive to deny publicly, even as it was happening in front of them. By now, a pattern had emerged that researchers couldn't ignore. Two populations, treated by American custom and by American law for centuries as biologically separate and unrelated, were in fact deeply measurably connected, not through some ancient distant migration lost to memory, through direct, recent, often violent contact repeated across generations on American soil, inside American households, sometimes under the same roof. The pattern repeated wherever researchers looked next. Self-identified European Americans carried, on average, a small but consistent trace of indigenous ancestry, clustered geographically in states like Louisiana and Oklahoma, regions shaped by early and sustained colonial contact between European settlers and native nations. The percentages were smaller than the African ancestry findings, but the geographic clustering pointed toward the same underlying truth. real people, real relationships, mostly absent from the version of American history taught in classrooms, textbooks, and family reunions alike. Latino Americans showed an even more layered signature because Latino was never really one population genetically, no matter how the census form tried to simplify it into a single checkbox. Mexican Americans carried a genome roughly split between European and Indigenous American ancestry, with a smaller African component. Puerto Ricans and Dominicans carried substantially higher African ancestry, a direct legacy of the Caribbean's deep involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. A single label had been quietly concealing at least 3 distinct colonial histories, playing out across an entire hemisphere over 500 years, each with its own timeline, its own dominant colonial powers, and its own patterns of coercion and mixing. More than 12 million Africans were forced onto ships bound for the Americas across roughly 4 centuries, torn from communities that stretched across the width of an entire continent. Roughly 400,000 of them arrived in what became the United States. Their descendants' genomes carry the record of that voyage, whether any manifest survived to document it or not. European colonization added its own layers on top, wave after wave, from England, Spain, France, Germany, Ireland, and Scandinavia, each settling into different regions, and leaving a genetic signature still legible in the data nearly 2 centuries later, long after the ships themselves were gone. Indigenous populations had already lived across the Americas for more than 15,000 years. According to genetic and archaeological evidence, when European contact began, having built and rebuilt societies across the continent long before any European vessel reached its shores. Colonization devastated their numbers through violence, forced displacement, and disease, wiping out entire communities within a matter of decades in some regions. But it didn't erase their genetic presence. It fractured it, folding surviving lineages into new, mixed populations across the continent. A presence now visible primarily through the ancestry carried by Latino and some European American descendants today, rather than through population numbers alone. The United States is, in genetic terms, an unusually compressed experiment in human population mixing. Most populations carry ancestry shaped by migrations that unfolded across tens of thousands of years, slowly blurring across generations until the signal fades into noise. America's mixed genetic signature was produced in roughly 400 years, driven by colonization, forced migration, and immigration arriving from nearly every continent within a handful of centuries, compressing what would elsewhere take millennia into a span that living memory can almost reach. A geneticist reading an American genome today is, in a real sense, reading recent history rather than deep prehistory. That compression is exactly why the patterns still show up so clearly. There hasn't been enough time for extensive mixing to blur the regional signatures researchers detected, the way it has in populations whose ancestral mixing happened tens of thousands of years earlier. The genetic echo of slavery across the Deep South, the trace of early colonial unions in Louisiana and Oklahoma, the distinct Caribbean versus Mexican ancestry patterns among Latino populations, all of it remains legible, like sediment layers that haven't yet had time to erode into uniformity, still separable if you know exactly where to look and what to measure. Genetic ancestry and lived racial identity in America have never mapped cleanly onto each other, and that gap is its own kind of evidence, arguably more revealing than any single statistic in the study. A person's genome might show meaningful African or indigenous ancestry, while their family has identified as white for 5 or 6 generations and been treated as white under the law for just as long, with every document, every school record, every marriage certificate reinforcing that identity. Genetics can reveal ancestry. It cannot and does not dictate identity, culture, or lived experience. Those remain separate questions, and equally real ones, and no DNA test can answer them on a person's behalf, no matter how precise its percentages appear. If you are an American watching this, some part of this story is very likely your own, whether or not you know it yet. The data doesn't apply only to the woman in South Carolina or the man in Utah. It applies statistically to a meaningful share of everyone whose family has lived on this continent for more than a few generations, regardless of how they were raised to identify or what box their family has checked for 100 years. This isn't speculation built for effect. It's the direct, unavoidable implication of the numbers themselves. Return one last time to that woman in South Carolina staring at a result she never expected to see. Her DNA wasn't wrong. Her family's story, in a sense, wasn't entirely wrong either. Somewhere in the 18th or 19th century, in a state with one of the highest concentrations of enslaved people in colonial America, an ancestor of hers lived through a history no one chose to record and no one chose to pass down at the dinner table. Her genome remembered exactly what her family's memory did not, holding on to a fact that every generation in between had quietly agreed to forget. Long before any census taker checked a box, long before any law tried to draw a permanent line between races, and long before any family decided which parts of its history to keep and which to quietly discard, the genome was already keeping its own record. It never asked permission to tell the truth. It simply waited patiently across every generation that chose not to speak of it, for the science to finally catch up and ask it the right question.